Well, here we go again to see what advices the church has for us. And the subject I picked for this week is the subject of violence. And I did it because of my experience with the subject and violent people from time to time. And let's just be clear, first of all, in terms of definition. Violence and violate is same root word. And violence is whenever a person's right to be or right to feel or right to think is prevented. In any way, that person is violated, and that's the experience of violence. So, it's just basically pretty clear. When a person is violated, that is that person's experience of violence. Now, when I worked through this material, I decided I'm going to flip-flop because I want to raise some questions for you first. And then I'll refer to them at the end, because these are the questions that I have and the questions that really drove my choice of this subject for this week. And my first question is, why has the U.S. become the most violent culture in the world? In my lifetime, in your lifetime, why has the U.S. become the most violent culture in the world? Secondly, why is domestic violence more likely to occur in families who are involved in a faith community rather than from families who are not involved in a faith community? Why is domestic violence more frequent in families that are involved in a faith community as over against those who are not? Really makes me scratch my head. And then a follow-up question: why do many who claim to be Christian today choose to base their faith on the legitimacy of violence in the pursuit of power rather than the legitimacy of nonviolence in pursuit of compassionate love? Those are the questions I have. And so, how in the world, do we experience that? You've got your experience with violence, I have mine, and I just have to admit that in my journey as a pastor, as a college president, and as a bishop, I've experienced a lot of violence, observed a lot of violence. And I realize that bullying, for instance, a form of violence, is as common among adults as it is among children or youth. Bullies don't outgrow being a bully. I've discovered that sexual and gender-based violence is as common among persons who have received higher education as it is those who have received limited formal education. Educational level doesn't disturb the inclination for sexual and gender-based violence. Gun violence. And the Book of Resolutions, we will deal with gun violence in a few minutes. But it doesn't deal with getting rid of guns. It doesn't talk about gun control. It talks about gun violence. And gun violence is because of who a person is. And they use guns as an instrument to express who they are. And finally, we blame the media. We'll deal with the media in a few minutes. But I realize that what's covered by the media is determined by the appetite of the consumer. And we are the consumers who have an appetite for violence in our culture today. You've got your experience, those are my experiences. So let's find out what advice the church has for those of us who are struggling with these issues, struggling with these questions. So first of all, the social principle. A short paragraph. We affirm all persons equally valuable in the sight of God. We support the basic rights of all persons to access to housing, education, communication, employment, medical care. We deplore the acts of hate or violence against groups or persons based on race, color, national origin, ethnicity, age, gender, disability status, economic condition, sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious affiliation. In other words, we are againers when it comes to the violation of a person's life or feelings or thoughts. The church's principle is against violence. Biblically, we can turn to all kinds of passages. And in the book of Resolutions, it quotes from Isaiah 59. So justice is driven back, and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets. That's 2,500 years ago. And in Ephesians, therefore put off falsehood and speak truthfully, for we are members of one body, all members of the same body. The human race is one body. And when we violate another human being, we are participants in the experience of violence. And so that's sort of where we begin our journey of looking at the biblical basis of, and we could quote from the prophets, we could quote from Jesus, but it's very, very clear where the biblical tradition is in terms of violence. And so let's deal with the climate of fear and hostility in the increased number of hate crimes. Reports of hate crimes or acts such as the following have become a part of our daily lives. A Muslim, Arab American woman receives a threat from a co-worker. You and your kids will pay. A Catholic high school student is punched and kicked on a bus by a group of youth for looking Chinese. A teenage boy is beaten with a baseball bat because of his perceived sexuality. Anti-Semitic graffiti is spray painted on Jewish gravestones. 4 men attacked and killed one of the 12 undocumented immigrants. That's our world of violence. And the book of Resolutions use those as a basis to call upon all of us to recognize, as we've dealt with other issues, the basic rights of human beings to feel, to think, to have opinions, to be who they are. And so let's look at some particular issues. And I mentioned bullying earlier in my journey of realizing how bullying is as common among adults as it is among children. This resolution states bullying is a behavioral expression of aggressiveness that attempts to yield power over another person or peoples. This may be expressed by physical or psychological means. There are persons today who suffer and die because another person seeks to overwhelm them by aggressive behavior. It is therefore resolved that in an effort to reduce bullying in society, United Methodist congregations will categorically oppose the practices of adult, youth, and child bullying, mobbing, and scapegoating, and diligently work to increase societal awareness of these destructive behavior. In other words, the resolution is advice to us to name it and claim it, if you will, in our community as well as in our culture. But violence in our culture and throughout the world has to do with sexual and gender-based violence. This is another resolution. All of creation is sacred in God's sight because many women and children, along with others, are ignored, abused, and violated. We urge renewed commitment to prohibiting violence against women and children in all of its forms. It takes different forms, but is always about power and control. Violence is a tool used by the strong to dominate the weak, and the powerful to dominate the vulnerable. Often the mere threat of violence is enough to achieve the goal of dominance and control. Human beings are especially vulnerable with respect to gender and sexuality, and therefore sexual and gender-based violence is devastating. Exploitation, abuse, and violence take many forms. Child marriage, female genital mutilation, child soldiers, displacement of persons, family violence, polygamy, human trafficking, and rape is an act of war. Gender and sexual-based violence is absolutely a disturbing phenomenon. It happens every day. In your neighborhood and in mine. Another statement, United Methodists have worked to eradicate the many forms of violence that destroy the integrity of individuals, families, communities, and nations. People of faith must work to change attitudes, beliefs, policies, and practices at all levels of society that dehumanize and promote the exploitation and abuse of women and girls. Women with equal rights are better educated, healthier, and have greater access to land, jobs, and financial resources because women and children, along with others, are ignored, abused, and violated. We urge renewed commitment to eradicating violence against women and children in all of its forms. It's incredible to think how common sexual and gender-based violence is among us. And then to touch on the issue of gun control, we must realize that gun violence is the issue that's before us. If there was no violence with guns, there wouldn't be a problem, but there is. And so a resolution is entitled, "Our Call to End Gun Violence." As followers of Jesus, called to live into the reality of God's dream of shalom as described in the prophet Micah, we must address the epidemic of gun violence so that he may teach us his ways and that we might walk in God's path. And God's path is a path of nonviolence. Let me just move away from the book of resolutions and remind us of a story of Gandhi, who was the human architect of nonviolence. And E. Stanley Jones, a Methodist evangelist, asked Gandhi one time in person, "Mahat, why are you not a Christian?" And he responded, "I'm not a Christian because of Christians." Mahatma Gandhi experienced Christians as participating in and advocating violence in many ways, including colonization. And remember the story of India, who experienced the violation of colonialism. For United Methodist congregation, we are to advocate at the local and national level for laws that prevent or reduce gun violence. And some of the measures include, and there's a list of 10, including universal background checks on all gun purchases, and many more. And the last one is promoting new technologies to aid law enforcement agencies to trace crime guns and promote public safety, because public safety is an exercise of nonviolence. We talk a lot about media and violence. In our society, media plays an important role. It influences people throughout the world. Content, representations, pictures, scenes are often a stark contrast to human and Christian values. We express disdain of dehumanizing portrayals, sensationalized through mass media, entertainment, and news. These practices degrade humankind and violate the teachings of Christ and the Bible. We must be energized about this issue that in fact reflects who we are rather than causing who we are at the beginning. There are a lot of advices. It is easy to blame the media. It is easy to blame the hierarchy of institutions. It is easy to blame institutional life, such as education. It is easy to blame the competitive nature of our capitalistic society. It is easy to blame. But you know, after spending a couple, 3 hours this week reading the book of resolutions, the book of resolutions say, hey, Bruce, enough blame is enough blame. Go to work yourself. For indeed, all of us are responsible for receiving the advice of the church and form our opinions, and make decisions that the non-violence character of God revealed in Jesus Christ can be reflected in the human community, including our culture, our denomination, our community, and our local church. The challenge is to deal with the questions that I raised at the beginning. Thanks for the time together.